crown of Loaded Magazine, Enemy, and GQ, and furthermore. Like, I've read this Animal House, and it is fantastic. You are what I'd like to call you is a cult hero. How do you feel about
that? One consonant out.
What? Which one?
The N.
No way. You have given so much to music, style, lads and young men across the world, like not just Britain, but you've done so much. I'm going to get into this a little bit later. I like to see you as a little bit like a cult hero for disaffected youth, a little bit like With Now. How do you feel about that as well?
Well, do you think With Now's a hero?
Yes, of course I do.
Okay, that's interesting. I love that film. I love that film.
It's my favourite film, and I know you love it. And there's people that think that With Now was the criminal in that film, but he's not. For me, I feel that With Now expressed exactly the moment of the time, just like you did.
Well, I don't think he's a criminal. I love that film a lot, and I was lucky enough to be able to meet Bruce, who kind of wrote it and filmed it, and a few times, and it's quite unique in that he isn't somebody who's had lots and lots of jobs in him, in terms of like sometimes people make great films or write great books, and it might be one of 20.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's written 2 or 3 books and made 2 or 3 films, and I like that. His subject.
It's important to a generation, just like you are.
Well, yeah. I'm to be honest, I did identify with Nell. I remember thinking, although I'd had a really good career at Enemy, and I was writing for the Sunday Times before Loaded came out, I did think if Loaded hadn't taken off, I might have ended up like With Nail, sort of drifting and lost. And I said to Bruce Robinson once, "What? It doesn't feel like the ending is true." Having sort of felt that disconnect, and he said, "You're right." In the original draft, after he's in the park and he said goodbye to Marwood, he goes home to the house.
The loaded shotgun with whiskey.
With the red wine that he's stolen from Monty's house. And he pours the wine down both barrels and commits suicide, shoots himself. Now, I don't actually know if you pour wine down the barrel of a shotgun, whether that would still allow it to work, but I'd sort of sensed that it was sort of like not the ending that was the natural ending. But he's a great character. And I think the thing is, that film came out in the first few months I worked at NME. I went to see it, and it was very identifiable for people who perhaps didn't feel like they fitted in life, or that, it really, even though I was in a place where I should have been in the NME, we're in the NME because there was, I guess the people that were there were ambitious but didn't see a natural path to anywhere else. And then by the time I was working on the development of Loaded and actually getting to the sharp end of putting that first issue out, which would be at the very end of 1993, and working on it for a couple of months, it really was a case of what shall I write for the first issue. And my friends and I all loved that film, and we talked about it and we quoted lines from each other, but I'd never seen that written down. I'd never seen an identification that there was this huge cult film, because by that point it was 7 years on or 6 years on from it being shown for the first time in the UK. And there were videos of it, but there just wasn't the digital platform that are now available to, we could mention a film and probably one of us within 5 minutes could go oh yeah, you can see that on Mubi, or you can see that on Amazon Prime, or you can whatever, you can see it on YouTube.
Yeah,
So
of course.
it was like an underground, not underground, but it was a non-documented existence that people um, shared the love of the film through the use of the language. And so it was kind of quite a common identifier of people that you would have things in common with if somebody referred to the film. And in a way, that was the rich territory that I was able to sort of write about and revel in for the main content from Loaded. It was things that my friends and I loved, and by that I don't mean my staff. I mean my mates that I was hanging out with before I put the team together, and nobody was writing about anything. Nobody was writing in magazines about anything I was really interested in. I mean,
But this is the magazine that was, you know, captioned with "For men that should know better."
but yeah, that was self-deprecating. It was
But is it? Is it really?
a phrase that I'd it was a phrase that I'd heard a lot, ranging from teachers telling me off for fucking around to friends telling me off for ruining relationships. And it just seemed quite an honest admission
But
rather
you,
than those two magazines that were sort of that I did sometimes see that I wanted more from, which were Arena and Esquire, and they weren't really for me, but I wanted to read something that was a monthly, looked good, read well, was well written, and they would seem Arena was very focused on design and fashion, and Esquire had that American thing of, I think Esquire's tagline was "Manatee's best" or something like that. And actually, very rarely at your best, are you? I spent
no.
my time at my worst, hungover, dicking around, being late, lying about why I was late, um, you know, wearing clothes, putting them back on the floor, not cultivating any structure in my life. So those when I mean I never read GQ. I might have seen the odd one, in the dentist waiting room. But when I would pick up
Yeah.
Squire and you'd see those photo shoots or Arena, it was very stylized, and it was aimed at quite a small market, I felt, of idealistic people. And it was just a different world to the world that I lived in and that my friends lived in.
But do you identify the fact that you've changed counterculture? I mean, this is what the Voices of the Ceremony. This is the podcast that you're on today. Everyone I speak to, I definitely believe has changed counterculture, and you yourself, James, with Loaded and everything you've done in between, even your book, it does. It speaks so much volume to young men, even today, that feel a certain way because you're honest, because you don't hide anything. And I think, like, even looking, like, when I pulled this back out today, like this Loaded, this, I had this today, and I was like, wow, that's weighty. That's a huge publication. It's a lot of work that's gone into this, and every single issue.
Hold that cover up.
This is the Irving on Null.
Yeah, see, very few. They say that you've got to have eye contact on the cover, but basically that's eyebrow contact.
It is, yeah. It
Nobody
is
else,
identifiable though.
no one else would do a Christmas issue with a black and white cover without seeing the smile on the face or some Father Christmas colors or something. I like that. And we were kind of. It was a period when now both of those people who wrote that, who created that cover, are totally and utterly revered. Irving Welsh, who wrote Trainspotting and The Acid House and many other great books, and obviously the film came out of that, and Noel Gallagher. But at the time, it was just like, what should we put on the Christmas? Why don't we do this? And it was both of them was just a phone call away. There was so much going on that you would go out at the period then, which is probably about the Christmas of 1995 or something, or 96. And you would just be surrounded by people who were young, having their first real flushes of success, first few years. They hadn't become idiots or anything like that, like previous generations, people who become successful had kind of locked themselves away and gone away into ivory towers. People were still very visible because Britain was such a social scene at the time. The real revolution had come at the end of the 80s in terms of how acid house and the sort of the Balearic beats had changed nightclubbing. They'd made it really good fun to go out, and before that, there was an inevitability that if you went out at some point, you might see a fight or get involved in a fight or whatever. And I think that you go 10 years on from there, which is around the time of the issue you just held up. It was just an exciting period. That's what I remember about it. And I don't just mean for me. I would meet people, whether it was in a bar in Nottingham or in a restaurant in New York or on a beach in Brighton at 1 o'clock in the morning, and people were excited by what was going on. They were excited by nightclubs. They're excited by comedy gigs. They're excited by books. They're excited by art, and thankfully, somebody had to get all that down. Somebody had
Yes.
to document it, and it's documented in those pages. And when I wrote my book, I had to stop myself reading all the 36 issues that I edited because I would never have got it done. There would have been too much to put in. And I think there's only really the episode when I write about when we took acid at the awards evening.
I
And
love that. I love that story that you took acid at the ceremony.
but there were like funny stories like that every week of every month when we were doing the issues, the process of creating the magazine, and it simply and seemingly being just mixed in with what was going on socially meant we were just constantly. It was stimulating. It was never boring, and there was just so much going on. I think as well because when I worked on the NME, everything that we were invited to or everything we went after covering involved DJs or bands.
Yeah.
It was all very, very similar. It was like people on stage. It was the age old thing of entertainers on stage or artists and the audience kind of like watching or partaking in dancing or whatever. But by the time Loaded came out, suddenly we were being inundated with information and opportunities from all walks of life. So it got to the point where we were getting offered so many opportunities to go and write about funny things that we didn't have enough people to do it. And I guess it's still like that, but I think it's like that probably if you're 25 or something. Um, and
I just feel that you've coined an expression, and I keep relaying this throughout my life since I see this. Do you remember the Live Forever, the Rise and Fall of Britpop documentary that you featured in?
yeah, John Batsek's documentary. Yes.
It's incredible, right? And you say something in there that stood with me for the rest of my life. And I was talking to the last episode of the Voices of Ceremony was with Brian Cannon, which is your friend.
I know.
We,
Yeah.
we briefly spoke about you, and I said what you coined this expression, and I've never heard it anywhere else. In the 90s, what if happened?
Yeah, but you know what? Do you know what I was thinking the other day? There were lots of things that we wanted to do that we had no way of doing. A very simple that happened now, that exists now. Very obvious thing was I wanted to do what became known as flash mobs. I remember talking about what happens if we got like 500 Loaded fans in yellow t-shirts at one end of Oxford Street and 500 in blue t-shirts at the other end, and they just marched down the street and met in the middle. For no other
Amazing.
reason, it would be incredibly funny. There was no way of doing that. And then the same, I remember lying around late at night, fucked up, thinking, oh, fuck, I wish we could just call a motorbike to bring drink to the door. And I mean, and so a lot of the things that we wanted then became, achievable. But that was because of the immediacy of digital communication. And I think now, if you're really into doing something, or if somebody comes up with a good idea, and it's very easy to interact with great things and mix with other people that share your interests and passions. So, in a way, there's probably not the same kind of like creative vacuums that there seemed to be at the time, or that, which is what I was talking about. There was that kind of an underground sense of things that young men or men loved that weren't being represented or written about or presented in any way. But the best thing in that documentary, the two
Go on.
things I remember about it, one is Jarvis's fingers are really long.
They are, aren't they? They're like octopus.
I don't know if that was the way the
I love the fact you said that, because we've
yeah, but
always said that. They're like
fingers
on the
are
bed.
like really, really long. But he says that great line, and I think he's interviewed in a little old-fashioned hotel just behind Mornington Crescent, which
Yeah,
was
it's a bed sit, isn't it?
near the office I used to work in Sounds magazine. And he was talking about cocaine, and he said, no one's ever said, oh, he's become such a nice person since he's been on that cocaine. And
And that sticks with me as well. That does stick with me as well.
that was
That
a brilliant observation. I like him in
it
that.
is.
I don't know Jarvis. I mean, I've spoken to him a couple of times, but I don't really know Pulp either. They're not like a big band for me or anything. But I thought that he's quite a unique guy, isn't he? And
Was he right in saying, because obviously you've been there, was he right in saying, you spend your life being on the dole or growing up with abject poverty and stuff, and then when you become someone, it's like, oh, welcome to Celebrity Club, and it's just shit. Is it like that? I don't know.
no, he's not shit at all. I think that's quite I think that's a very, very blasé attitude because, first of all, I've hardly ever paid to get into anything.
Right. Okay.
So for years and years, when and I know what he's talking about because I was sort of in the same county at the same time, signing on, or he was trying to get Pulp going. I was doing my fanzine. You know, you don't have money for years and years and years, and then the madness is by the time you're earning money, you don't have to pay for anything anyway.
You
Because
say it in your book.
for him, as opposed to somebody who works in the media but a pop star, I mean, everything's free. So no, I mean, no, it's not shit. I think there's an element of some famous people when you're around them is quite vacuous and insecure. But no, my experience of suddenly having access to the benefits of being well known were far from shit. I mean, do you know what? I'd rather be where I was then than when I was, living off cornflakes and cans of peas.
Well, I was gonna ask you, because obviously Loaded in its form is absolutely, like, especially when you were editor. Um, when you went over to GQ,
Yes,
I was gonna ask you, how on earth did you survive that? Because obviously I've read the book.
only lasted 18 issues.
It was uh, it was a completely different world for you.
Well, what it was, I mean, that's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that question, but the very simple fact was it was a much nicer place to work. It was much less frustrating place to work than at IPC because at Condé Nast, it was a really great company. I got on very well with the guy who was in charge of it, who was a man called Jonathan Newhouse. I really liked him, and he seemed to really like me. And they were brilliant with their editors. They basically just said, just go for it, do what you want within reason. And they didn't interfere. they treated they knew that the better the editorial, the more advertising they could sell, and they were quite honest about the way the business worked. They just gave me a flat plan, as we call it, which was a number of pages with boxes on it representing each page of the magazine. And they'd already taken all the ones they wanted for their adverts, and they just said, fill that. And it just was a really nice place to work. The people were very supportive of me when I was having my problems with drink. I had some really good staff. My PA, Alex, was absolutely brilliant. She made life.
It's more professional. It's more
Yeah,
professional.
much less bureaucratic, much faster moving, much better paid. IPC, they resented the success Loaded had.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the simplest example of that. A guy called Rob Stringer, who I think he still runs CBS Records, maybe for the world now, Sony or CBS. Rob was like a really hot A&R man at CBS Sony in London. And he came to me one day and he said, we've done these great these CDs with Top Gear TV show before Top Gear became hot, but it still had its cult following. He said, and they're driving CDs, great CDs for the audience. What do you think about? Do you think you could do some Loaded party CDs? I said, that's a great idea. So I went away and I wrote out, enough track lists for 3 or 4 CDs. And he said, this is great. Let's do a deal. I'll give you this. I was going to get like a point on it, and I'll license it and everything. You go and talk to IPC about it. So when I went to see the publishing director, and I explained, this will be great. They're going to advertise it on TV. This is what IPC will get, and this is what Sony will get, and I'm getting this. And it wasn't a big bit. It was in terms of, if there was, say, 10 points available, it was sort of 2 of them. And those 2 other parties were going to get 3 or 4 each or whatever. And the guy said, why are you getting anything? And I said, well, I've kind of put the deal together. I've bought it in. And they want me to have it because they want me to say that I've chosen the track listings for this. They saw it as the score. I mean, we don't have it so much now because of streaming and digital radio, but you would go in in a garage on the M1, and there'd be like 50 great compilations to put on whilst you were listening, and that was the target. That was the sort of target market and the audience. So that was the sort of stuff I had to put up with. Whereas at Condé Nast, it was like, they just kind of paid their editors well. I mean, it was just
But how did it feel for you personally? Because obviously,
I loved it.
You wasn't part of, when you were growing up and you'd done Loaded, you wasn't part of that sort of world. So you just went into a different world.
No, that's a good point. And but Mitchell, but the thing is, the discovery that some posh people are really nice was a total revelation. And the reality is, being able to go to I mean, this is pretty self-indulgent stuff, but being able to go to Caprice or the Ivy every day for lunch, and for Condé Nast to pay for it, as opposed to going.
Yeah, well, everyone would love that. Of course they would.
Exactly. I mean, it was a brilliant place to work, and I was.
Did you feel looked after? Did you finally feel? Did you finally feel looked after and listened to?
Pardon?
Did you finally feel looked after and listened to?
Well, I mean, I was being listened to because there was like 500,000 people behind my magazine, so and people queuing up to get my opinion before that. But yeah, I felt like some of the people there were looking.
But IPC were like, they listened to you in some aspect from what your book says, but they wouldn't trust you with certain other things, and they also didn't give a shit about your health or what was going on. But when you went to Condé Nast, it was more like, are you okay? Let me look after you.
It's absolutely true. There were 2 or 3 people there, and who really went out of the way to look after me. So Jonathan Newhouse, Susanna A. Moore, who was the HR lady, a couple of other people, and then I had a friend there I had a friend of mine called Sarah. I was asking her when I was writing my book. I said, why do you think all those people like Bridget, who looked after all the catering there for the fine dinners and events that they would have on the receptions, she was very nice to me. And she said, why do you think they were all looking out for me? And she said, because they could just see what a fucking mess you were in. And I said, was it that obvious? And he said, yeah, totally. You were. And I think at Loaded, being drunk and fucked up and doing stupid and dangerous things, there was lots of us. That was an environment that I encouraged to generate great content. But
Yeah, yeah,
what became apparent was when I went to Contact Nast and behaved like that, it really stuck out as being not normal behavior. And yeah, and this is, I'm glad you've asked me this, because I'm not that I know if anyone gives a fuck about it, but for me, um Condé Nast was really, it was an incredibly important place for me to go to, because they put me into a
yeah.
rehab process. I mean, they wanted me to go into residential rehab, but I was worried if I went away for a month or two, I might come back and either not want to do the job or not be able to do the job. So they put me into a twice weekly um, series of rehab sessions with a therapist, and that changed my life
Yeah,
significantly for the better. And when at the start of the interview, when you said that I've influenced lots of young people, what I am um, pleased I've been able to do is, as a consequence of getting sober and continuing to have a good time in my life, just because the drink and the drugs went, that as people have come to me, or I've been able to say, actually, yeah, you can do this. It's fine. Your life doesn't end when you stop being a fucking mess, because
absolutely.
you're using too much, you're drinking too much, or using too many drugs or whatever. So that all stems from somebody saying to me, "Do you need help?" And that was the first time that anyone had asked me that. There was only two people that I remembered who'd ever said anything about my drinking. One one was Frank Skinner, who himself I didn't know. And I didn't really, I knew Frank to say hello over an event, had a chat, and he'd been in the magazine, but he wasn't a friend or anything. And he said to me, James, all your stories start with about you being fucked up or drunk. So basically, in a very polite way, he was saying, your stories are boring or whatever. Or maybe he was just observing that that was my outlook on life, which it was. And then the other one was Damien Hirst, when he once said to me, we'll continue this conversation when you're sober. So they were the only two people. I mean, and the fashion designer Paul Smith as well had made some suggestions that he'd got um, from a friend of his who was sober and had stopped using drugs, about how to minimize the excessive behavior. So those three people, and that's not just to name drop. I obviously spent lots of time with just everyday people. It wasn't like I was just hanging out, but maybe their confidence in their own success and themselves meant they didn't give much of a fuck for slightly offending me or whatever. But they, before that, apart from those three people, it was just one ongoing kind of rolling ball of excess and getting worse and worse in terms of how much I was using. And but the thing is, somebody wrote to me a while ago, asked me if that was, or saying that was that driven by negatives. It wasn't. I mean, I like doing it. That was
I,
that.
I was going to say, James, because I see a lot of myself in you, especially when I've watched the documentary and I've read your book, and especially about sobriety, right? So, and drug using and drinking. I mean, I was an alcoholic. I was clinically told I was an alcoholic at the age of about 28. I was in a band. I was drinking about 3 bottles of red wine a night, and on the weekend I was doing about 5 bottles of prosecco with cocaine, just going fucking mad, really going for it. I ended up in about 5 different help groups and stuff, and then I spent 3 years of my life completely sober. All I did was smoke, and I'd run, and I'd done everything like that. Um, but at that point in my life where I was, I created a lot of stuff, including this show, which was really, really great. And
Yeah.
a lot of people come back to me going, "Oh well, you know, you're not a cunt now," sort of thing. You're a nice guy now, sort of thing. Because I was like Keith Moon. I was like, I had a good time. I was never violent or horrible, but I used to have a good time. You know, wherever we were going. And then after that, I had to relearn because what I didn't like is I didn't like the idea of being sober forever. So I had to relearn how to just have a drink without going mad. But then something really miraculous happened to me. I mean, I married my now wife, and I'm a stepfather of three children. So I have a purpose.
Yes.
And
A
my
responsibility that meant you had to think beyond yourself.
Absolutely. So then I had to relearn uh, without being selfish. And without being selfish, you could just go, well, one of the most miraculous things, even to this day, even last night, where I'll have a beer and go, no, I'll tip it down the sink. And for
Yeah.
me, that is a really mad thing for me to go, yeah, cool. And
Yeah.
that for me is an achievement. I was going to do like a TED talk on the fact that addicts. I wanted to get your thing on this actually. That addicts have got so much pressure on them all the time. Like where you go, well, once an addict, always an addict, and you get pressure, whether family or friends or whatever. They never want to ever try to go back to anything because of the shame it might bring, and the shame I believe is like a real big pressure thing. I'm not saying that it's the same for everybody because everyone's different.
No, it's a good description. It's like being trapped in a vice of your own choice. And then you kind of step into the vice, it's tightened, and then you fucking can't get out of it. And
It
I think
is. It's a thing. Like I explained to somebody and you did in the documentary that I didn't know who I was without a drink in my hand. I had to relearn the most uncomfortable version of myself I've never known.
yeah, but I think in life you do change as you go through life, and different things give you a different perspective. So what you've just described there about being able to think of other people like your partner's children rather than just yourself, that's a benefit. Some people might not see the benefits in that situation, or but it's more than just the fun of being around these kids. It's what you're required to do as a parent that makes you a better person. That's not to say you can't be a better person if you don't have children. But what I mean is, if you're in that situation you've described where your primary function is just to change the way you feel, be excessive, um, to suddenly be thinking, what is the consequence of my behavior here? Because I don't want to be, to use your word, a cunt in front of these children. That's basically growth. That's human,
Absolutely.
emotional,
Absolutely.
psychological growth, which if you stay the same the whole of your life, you're missing out.
Absolutely agree. I absolutely agree because you can become you're the serial player in your life, and you can also identify what you need and what you don't need. I mean, like in your book as well, like I really identified with it, where you could just drop out drugs very, very easily, and I did. Like the cocaine, I dropped out. Like I was just like, oh, it's very simple to do that. One, it's expensive. Two, you got to stay up too late to get someone's drug dealer. You got to do this, do that, blah blah blah. But the drink is so accessible, where you can go into a shop with a handful of change.
Well,
You can
it's not accessible. It's seen as a social requirement in many situations, whether it's a celebration like
absolutely
something to do with work or getting married,
funeral.
birthday, or the arrival of a baby, or the arrival on a holiday, or I mean, I used to have different drinks that I would have for train journeys, plane journeys, particular pubs, whether I was drinking on my own or drinking with other people, different countries. I'd have different drinks, different cities,
Do you
and
miss it?
pardon.
Do you miss it?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I think sometimes people are surprised when I say that. Um, I didn't. I didn't stop drinking because I didn't like it. I stopped drinking because I didn't like how I became
Yeah.
after like 12 hours of drinking or whatever, or 7 hours, or any numbers of drink. I didn't like where it was drifting, where it was taking me to, because it'd become repetitive and it felt like it was beyond my control. But prior to that, I mean, sometimes I tell you what I miss is the random nature of where you can end up. I miss that. I remember
Yeah.
I remember one night when I was sober, I went out for a meal with a friend of mine from Los Angeles, a musician, and he said, I'm bringing a couple of mates along, and it was Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols, and I can't remember who else it was.
What a legend.
And then we went to a gig, and then we ended up back at Marco Peroni's house from Adam and the Ants, in kind of Mayfair area of London, and Steve sat there. He got one of Marco's guitars, and he was playing the Pistols riffs. Now at that point, the Pistols had done their reformation in about 1996 or something, or 1995, but they hadn't. It's not like now when they're back again,
Yeah.
and been such a big inspiration for me as a kid. And even at Loaded, I used to listen to them every morning before I went to work, just to get in the right frame of mind. And so that was one of those nights where at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, before I got the phone call to say I'm in town, do you want to meet up? I would never have predicted that, like, kind of 5 hours later, I'd been sitting in one of Adam and the Ants' house, listening to a Sex Pistol playing the beginning to, you know, Pretty Vacant or whatever. And I miss that with drinking. I miss going out, and I also miss sometimes how it anchors you in a place rather than you floating around and not knowing where you're going. But I mean, my girlfriend doesn't drink either. And we just came back from lunch in a pub, and I said, let's just pop in the other pub. I want to see if my mates there who I watch football with, and had they been there, I'd have been quite happy just to sit down and hang out with them and talk to them about football, for instance. So I find if I'm with people who I like and it's not too Larry, that I'm okay in pubs. I miss it when it's a lovely summer's day and maybe you see people dining outside a restaurant or whatever, or a pub, and it looks quite idyllic. I kind of miss that, the idea that I could maybe have a couple of glasses of wine, but I know myself enough through many, many nights of or afternoons of recurring behavior to know that I couldn't do that. And anytime I doubt whether I can do that, just give me like a box of biscuits and I'll eat them all. Well, even last night I was gripped by the return of addictive behavior. It's something I've seen people talk about for years and years, and I've never done. My little boy plays the football game FIFA,
Yeah.
which I like playing with him, and I played it with my eldest son when he was a kid, but it's not something I've ever done myself. And then he showed me how to play career mode, where every game you play is part of a season of a team that you manage, and you have to buy and sell the players and choose who's playing and deal with. And it was just like, that's one of my big loves of my life, football, and I was hooked. Literally finished some work I was doing at 4:30, had dinner with my girlfriend at one point, and then before that and after that until 3 o'clock in the morning, I was playing this game, and I wanted to go to bed, but I also wanted the next hit of the next result. And it was literally, I mean, I woke up and I said, I'm not doing that again, because I was totally and utterly aware of the addictive nature of what I was doing. And I had to treat it like I'm not going to pick up a drink again, and I'll do it in moderation with my little boy when he's back. Um, so I don't have any doubts that drinking again wouldn't be good for me, and I'm fine with other people doing it. Whatever else other people do,
I was the same. Like every time I went to a
I don't.
bar.
I don't look down on other people. I don't disapprove of other people. In fact, if I see somebody in a bad way, I'm more likely than not, if it's appropriate, just to maybe talk to them a little bit about it, or just wish them well, whatever. I mean, quite often people aren't in a great place, but then again, often people are in a great place when they're drunk and having a brilliant time. So, being really honest, yes, I do. I miss the act, particularly the early hours. But you got to realise I didn't drink normally. I mean, one night I woke up. I went out in Peru and I woke up in Colombia. That's like going out. That's like going out in Camden and waking up in Athens.
This is why I was saying you're like a little bit of a cult hero in that sense of, although it's nothing to be championed, James, it's a little bit like, wow, like I was going to talk to you, like I've scrubbed
Well,
this bit out.
I'd blasted about like 500 quid or something getting from A to B. And I didn't enjoy being in Colombia. The person I thought I would see there wasn't there before we could contact everybody instantly. And I just stayed in a hotel and I went back to the airport and went back to Lima. Look it up on Google Maps. They're not nearby. They're not. It's not like going from Manchester to Birmingham. It's not like
You
going
have had
to Eastbourne. It's a fucking long way.
You've had an incredible life, and I've got it here, and I've scrubbed out the first line here, and I'll read it that I scrubbed out. I was like, "You're like the real life world, the Wolf of Wall Street, or Forrest Gump." And I was like, "I see a lot of myself in you. You're like with now a cult hero of the disaffected youth. You have done what every young man would ever dream of, and." Is there going to be a film about your life? If not, why? And secondly, I believe it would be a little bit like Spun crossed with Almost Famous.
It would be a little bit what was the first film?
Have you ever seen Spun?
SPUN.
Yeah.
No, I haven't. I'll look that up.
It was very, very interesting. I'm surprised you've not seen it.
Quote. Keep going with the quote. Don't worry about that. I'll look it up.
It was that film was like it was edited very differently because it was all about speed freaks. So it was edited with really close up.
Do you mean Amphetamine or Momentum?
Amphetamine, yeah. So they had like Mickey Rourke, Brittany Murphy in there. They had it was a lot of famous people in there, and they edited it like you was on drugs.
Yeah, like have you seen Uncut Gems?
I haven't, no.
Oh, you should watch that. That's like and the same writers, the same directors made another film before that was also really intense. Watch Uncut Gems. It's really.
I will.
It's not so much the edit. It's the constant hyper performance of Adam Sandler, who you wouldn't think you would say that about because he's mainly like entertainment and kids and so on.
Yeah,
it's absolutely brilliant. It's about a diamond dealer. Mainly, I think he's maybe got a gambling habit as well, or he's in debt. It's a brilliant film and Almost Famous. I mean, I haven't seen Spun. Wolf of Wall Street. When that came out, a few people started talking to me about it, and then I went out to see Brighton Leeds with John, who was somebody I worked with for years, and he was on Loaded and later on my own company, IFG, and and he said, "Have you seen Wolf of Wall Street?" I said, "I haven't, but people are keeping mentioning it." And he said, "Do you think I should watch it?" And he went, "No, don't." He said it might make you relapse or something. But the thing is, when I did watch it, we weren't like that because we weren't cunts. We weren't.
No.
Loaded was providing something that was making people love the product, the magazine. They would love reading it. They were getting entertainment from it. People like being in it. People like going to our parties and road shows and stuff. Whereas they were ripping people off. Also, they were spending their money that they were making a lot of money on hookers and stuff like that. And whereas at Loaded, we weren't making a lot of money. We were having a lot of good times, and we didn't have to pay to have sex. because we just met loads of great girls or whatever along the way. And so I didn't actually, I thought apart from the excess, I didn't actually see the similar.
This is why I said that it would be a good
No, but the other
between
comment,
between Spun, Almost Famous, Wolf of Wall Street, and With Now and
that
I.
film is very life. That film, Almost Famous, is very like my life as a music
Yeah.
writer, very similar. But and when I went to see that with a friend of mine, and I turned to her and said, "This is what my life was like on Sounds and the Enemy." But the difference was he's kind of in a really stately tour bus going from Los Angeles to Nevada, whereas to Los Angeles to Las Vegas. I was in a fucking van going from like Manchester to Hull. And it wasn't quite as glamorous, but it was. And then that scene where they're in the party and somebody dives off the roof into the swimming pool. I mean, that's the sort of the rich American teen scene that you always see in films.
But
And
I can imagine. I can imagine. I can
like
imagine Decent doing that.
well,
Come on.
I don't really know what Martin's life's like before or after the sort of magazines, but you'd have to ask him if his life was like that. I mean, I think. I
But
mean,
he
I
would have done that and
I
wrote
was
about it,
someone
and
who
it would
would
have been.
dive off the fucking roof. You know, Martin was very good at writing about the incidents he got into, but I was more the person that would do the stupid thing, I think.
Well, by the way, James, you did say in your book, if James Brown told you to jump in a river,
That was what the teachers used to ask the kids.
yeah, and then everyone at Loaded did, and you stood by the sideline and watched everyone jump into a cold
I
river
mean,
one day.
yeah, that was a little. I mean, you got to realise I didn't really like school that much. I like being in an environment of a lot of people. I like making people laugh.
Dude, this
I
is
didn't
why you're a hero.
I didn't do
Because
any homework. I didn't. I felt like I don't think it anymore because it's so long. It's like 45, 43, 44 years since I was at school. But um, for a long time, I was just quite happy I wasn't at school. And I
yeah, but
was
this is why you're a hero, because most people don't like being at school, but you actually caned it and turned your life around into a very successful editor and writer, and you literally told the teachers, "Well, fuck you, I'm going to do it," and you've
you
done
know
it.
what? To be fair to them, two teachers in particular were incredibly helpful. The head of the sixth form I went to for 18 months before I didn't finish my A levels, Mr. Frost, David Frost, ironically is his name. He gave me a fucking amazing leaving speech when he for the final time he tried to get me to get my head down and concentrate, and the various incidents of things that had happened that he gave me this speech where I was just covered in glass. I was absolutely covered in glass where I'd booted a football and it hit a strip light and it all kind of fluttered down. Quite a photogenic sort of look.
This is in the
Cinema.
book. I know. Yeah, this is in the
But
book.
he gave me that speech at that point. I was covered in glass, saying, "Come on," looking at me, and almost he wasn't angry. It was almost like disbelief and despair of like, "Come on." And he said, "You all you got to do is do a few months studying, and you'll get good results. You're bright. You'll get to university." And I kind of looked at him. I said, "You know what? I don't want to go to university other than to meet girls and play football. I go to the university." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I go to Leeds University every week. I go to Bradford University. I go to universities and polytechnics in Liverpool and Sheffield and Newcastle and Hull and I go and sell my fanzine and I look at all those people and I think if I went to university, I would just fucking waste space of an education and there'd be somebody else who probably really needs to get an education who needs that space, and I don't have the discipline to do it. So I just want to go off and do my little magazine, and at that point I was late for school a lot, or not going because I was just hitchhiking around. I mean, me and my mate were hitching to London when we were at school. It was like Now I think about it now as a parent, you think, Jesus fucking Christ, if my son, when he was 17, had told me he was 200 miles away, I'd be really worried. And
Of
but
course, yeah, it's very different.
we thought nothing. I used to go off on my own hitching all over the country, and so when he heard me say that kind of from the heart, he just gave me this most amazing speech. It was brilliant. It was just an absolutely brilliant speech. And he said, "Well, go on." I mean, it was a little tinged with the vision of the possibility of the 60s from when he'd left school. You know, go and pick tea in India or become a rock star. He said, "You can do anything," and it was absolutely fantastic. And then also the teacher that I knew, not from school, but from having met him at a gig, Gary Lovelace, who's sadly not very well now, but he him and his mate and I used to. He had a car. I only knew one person with a car, you know, and apart from my dad, he had a car, but he would never give me a lift. So, Gary used to. I used to say, look, Serious Drinking are on, or the Three Johns are on. All these kind of bands are like. We would go to Nottingham or Sheffield or whatever and see these bands, and then we'd come back. I'd get us on the guest list, and he was never my teacher at school, but it was a really big school that I went to with, like, probably a couple of thousand kids or 1,500 kids or something. And so I'd never ever had that relationship with him. But, technically, there weren't many teachers hanging out with pupils on a school night in Nottingham watching a band. So, and he would be talking to me in a way that was incredibly encouraging of what I was doing. So those two people in particular, and then the teachers, there were teachers that liked me and that helped me and supported me. Maybe a couple of them knew that things were a little bit difficult for me at home and for the family, but so I think what I learned from that was the system might not have helped me, but some of the people in the system were very helpful. And you just don't have to accept the things that are given to you by
No, no,
the perceived establishment that's there to shape our lives. Whether that's religion, that doesn't really hold much of a sway for most English people anymore. Um, whether it's the police and the laws often are just, not really there to help people, although many of them obviously are. Whether it's the bosses, jobs, teachers, or whatever, particularly if you go back to that time. I mean, now we live in an era when people who are creative and entrepreneurial or artistic are often, there's a Brit school, there's Dragon's Den, there's all sorts of things that actually celebrate individual ambition and possibility of where you might go in life. But if you go back 40, 50 years to when I was a kid, all I remember hearing is get off that roof, get down from that wall. No, you can't do that. No, we can't do that. No, just that's a stupid idea. Or no, just concentrate on what you're doing, And it was like, no, 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 no. And so loads
yeah.
of fucking explosion against that. And it was yes, 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 yes. And that line that you said, that I don't remember saying on that documentary about the 90s was when, and the what ifs came true. That's what it felt like. So that's why I take odds with whatever
But
it
this is what you said about Loaded as well. That Loaded never ever cut anyone down. Like it was all like, yes, very positive. This is what we
yeah,
like. This is not what we don't like. So
yeah,
you never like put anyone down. You didn't do anything shit like that. You didn't like try to.
that was slightly that was that was a little bit of that was my experience of having spent a lot of time in America by that point.
Okay.
By 94, I'd been I'd probably been in America like maybe 20 times with many, many different bands, sometimes occasionally just on holiday to cities like New York or LA, but mainly to go and interview people and just reading the American media. And I really wish I'd actually been a little bit more focused when opportunities were presented to me to go and work there. Um, and somebody once said to me, in America, the difference between Americans and British people is Americans will be really friendly with you till they get to know you. whereas
Right.
British people won't be friendly with you until they get to know you. So and they sort of, I mean, this is part of the reason why Trump is accepted by so many people, because they love success there, because they think not, oh, that's just something happening to them, it'll never happen to me, which is kind of like a little bit like the British class system.
Yeah.
They stamp down on you. But what it is it's saying he's having his term, it'll be my term next. And I guess where they just miss out is, he's been given everything on a silver spoon. He's been fed everything on a silver spoon. He's
Yeah.
not really like the guy, who the great entrepreneur who started, and the same with Musk. These are not people who've started out with nothing and created great products or useful, successful inventions, or hard work has led to great businesses. It's a different setup, and I suppose that's what's strange over there, that people cannot see through the fucking lies. To what the emperor's got no clothes on, and then they can't see that.
Perfect. Yeah. The Emperor's got no clothes. I mean, like I was saying about disaffected youth and heroes and stuff, it's usually the people that, when I was speaking to Brian Cannon, as well as yourself, and we were speaking about yourself, a lot of your generation actually come from punk ethic of do it yourself. And there's
Yeah.
people like you, Irvin, Noel, Brian himself, like just created such a whirlwind in counterculture and changed culture for not just the British people, but in the world at that time.
But I would say that is because all four of those people you've just mentioned, we probably all spent quite a bit of time on the dole, all felt like we were kicking on the door that wasn't going to open. And because we weren't offered many great opportunities, what you do is you focus on the thing you love. And if you mix that passion with, you get a little chink of opportunity arises, you take it. And I think, when you read about how Nigel Farage got his first job by going to play golf with a friend of his dad, then my life wasn't like that. There was no golf with a friend of my dad. It was
No.
just get on with the thing I love. Can we hold on just a minute? My phone's ringing. I need to turn it off. Yeah, I guess, when you went back to the beginning and you were very kindly saying those nice things about me, I guess I grew up being told you don't have to accept what's on offer.
Okay.
And it's easier to do that if there's not much on offer. And
Right.
if
Okay.
you compare my childhood to the childhood of a 15-year-old in an Indian slum, then obviously I had a lot more on offer than, the average day in a third world country. But in terms of people going to play golf with their dad's mate, and then just saying, "Oh, we'll start you in the stock market," okay, go and work with those brokers. That wasn't the world that I grew up in, and I think all of those people like Noel and Brian Cannon and Irvin and I think we come from very similar backgrounds. Comprehensive schools up north and even up further north in Scotland. Probably listen to a lot of the same records. It's hard to talk about the impact of seeing and hearing punk rock without sounding just like a cliche, but it was so anti everything that we were being told we had to accept, that it was totally and utterly invigorating and exciting, and that was incredibly inspiring. The fact that people were giving a V sign to what was on offer, but sort of slating the country and the royal family and so on, and their contempt for those institutions. I mean, when you hear that and you're 12 years old,
Yeah.
I mean, my little boy's 11 and he's just consuming information all the time, and there's lots of bandwidth in his head to just take stuff on. And when you see that and you hear that sound, and the Pistols actually quite sound like Slade. Steve Jones
Of
doesn't
course, yeah.
miles away from the music that I'd liked a couple of years before when I was first kind of getting into music. And so I think, yeah, punk was a huge, huge influence. I mean, you hear it in Oasis. You can, when Oasis started, to me, they obviously sounded like a mix of T-Rex, the Mary Chain, the Pistols, and the Happy Mondays. They were and then obviously later the Beatles, and so that was there. And then the same with when you see and hear and read Trainspotting. The influences were the acts that influenced punk. So when you see it talking about Lou Reed and Iggy in those books, and the love of that was something that was prevalent in the area that I grew up in the Gothic ghetto of Leeds 6, which is the student area now. But it was also where a lot of the goth bands that became very successful were kind of hanging out. And then just to say, you can hear Johnny Rotten's snarl in Liam's delivery of
course.
alcohol, and so yeah.
Can I just pick your brains just for a second, James?
Yes.
I'd like you to go back to James Brown, editor, literally the man of the moment, literally with the world at his feet. And I'm going to go right back, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about your expertise, because this is why we want to talk to you today, because of obviously cultural change and counterculture. So let's get comfy and let's pick your brains about a few things. So one of my first questions would be, for somebody doing something like what I'm doing today, like with my show about music, rock and roll,
yes.
How would you approach it to these times that we've got so much internet and so much everything like going on? Like you just said about your son has got so much. It's everywhere, and it is everywhere, and it's so hard to cut through to try to reach people. So if I said to you, right, so I was a multi-billionaire and said, James, I need you to help me with this. Where would you go at this time? Like, especially when AI is around.
I think people say to me, where are the modern equivalent? But when I look at those things that my son watches, when you see those guys like who played, those vloggers who played in that Sidemen football match at Wembley, and then when you actually watch the content, they're just normal blokes fucking around. They're not particularly hilarious or anything. They're just guys like kicking balls into nets, or
But what are they doing differently?
Yeah, but that's not dissimilar to what we did at Loaded. We were just sitting around testing breakfast cereals, or sitting around trying to sleep in a cave for a week. I mean, those experiences that then Pete Stanton or Martin Deason or whoever would go away and write down are very, very similar to, what they were doing. What they were doing, and what they're doing now on YouTube channels. And I think, when I was talking about with my girlfriend about this 14 hours I spent yesterday managing this football team for a whole season on FIFA, which is obviously very behind the times doing, like 30 years or something. At Loaded one weekend, we left the office at about 6 o'clock on a Friday. And the nerds, as we called them, Adam and Mike, who looked after the fledgling internet site, and Pete, who was one of the writers who sat next to them, they were playing this computer game. And when we came in on Monday morning, they were still there. And there were sleeping bags out, and there were like piles and piles of takeaway deliveries. And, because the other thing was down by the loaded office, there weren't any shops or anything. Now on the south bank of the Thames, there are lots of shops and restaurants. But in those days, there was like a couple of pubs, a couple of restaurants. There was no, even like 10 years ago when I used to work there on Talksport, there was no shop that was open. So these guys had spent, what is that, like 48, 60 hours until we all came in again on Monday morning at 10 o'clock, just playing these games. Now that, if they'd filmed that and filmed the process of it and edited it and put it online, or even if they'd just written about it, that would reflect what the vloggers are doing now. So there were no real barriers to entry once you worked on Loaded. You could come up to me and say, I want to write a piece about whether, who's hardest, Jean-Claude Van Damme or some other kung fu action star, Chuck Norris or whatever. And I'd go, yeah, that sounds good. If somebody wanted to write about something that they were passionate about, it made me think, well, there's probably other people who have these same discussions. And it's like that now as people build up their podcasts and their YouTube channels. The more you're into doing something and having the ability to edit it and put it out there for the world, it's a similar thing. The only thing you need a real talent for is the ability to make the reel or the film or the whatever. Do you need to know?
Do you think that one of the real talents is to be honest as well, like you was?
Yeah, but that's what they're doing. I think I like that illustrator, Mr. Bingstagram. Do you know him?
Yes. Yeah.
His stuff's really funny. That he doesn't have any filter on his observations. That he then just sticks down with a little cartoon. It's very very similar to Modern Toss, which was produced by two of the original staff members from Loaded. But that sort of observational honesty is very appealing, and I do think that was one of the reasons Loaded really cut through to the audience and very quickly early on developed a very loyal audience readership, just because they saw themselves.
I think that's true, especially like with my show. Like I'm not going to talk about myself, but in terms of the cult of GlassOnion, like every time I do an interview, just like we are doing now, I always say it's like bar stool preaching. Like I'll have a cigarette, I'll have a drink, like just chill out and we just have a chat. And when we put it out, like all the listeners and all the people that follow, they like the fact that it's just like that. It's not trying to be anything other than if I met you in a bar and have a chat.
Have you really got 10,000 followers on Instagram?
Yeah, of course I have. Yeah, well, 11. It's over 11,000 now.
That's great. And why do you think that's built up?
I think because of the honesty. I mean, we used to do a radio show. It used to be a 2-hour radio show in Highgate at the Boogaloo. I think it used to be called Filthy McNasty's.
No, Boogaloo is the pub now. Jerry's, who owns the Boogaloo.
Oh, you know Jerry O'Boyle.
Jerry had a previous pub in King's Cross, Islington border called Filthy McNasty's.
I thought both of them were.
No, it's a different place.
Oh, okay. I thought both of them were. But anyway, we ended up in the Shane McGowan's bin shed in the 24-hour radio station there. We done a Sunday service there, 2 to 4. We called it the Godless Church, like the GlassOnion radio show, and we didn't give a fuck. Like we just swore, we just done whatever we wanted to do.
He's a great visionary guy, for doing things within his pub. So at Filthy's, he used to have these reading nights called Vox and Roll. And what he realised was if anyone ever had somebody doing a reading, the author would be stood there for an hour. Everybody would want a fucking drink. They weren't taking any money. So he introduced this thing where an author would read for 15 minutes and then there'd be 15 minutes of music that they liked on a predetermined playlist. So everyone would get a drink and then they'd do another 15. Then it'd be another 15 minutes. And the author would do 45 minutes in 90 and the other 45 minutes were 3 chunks of music that they loved. He was great for doing things like that. And, Jerry was the only, I can't go into why, but he was the only person who asked me not to put a brilliant story in because
Let's do it, James. Go on, you tell me the story.
I'm not going to tell it because
Legality.
not the legality, just the privacy of some people who were incredibly dangerous and violent.
Okay, yeah, let's not do that then. That's fine.
And so he said to me, "You must have enough good stories." But the reason I wrote about Phil Feast was because that was the first pub I ever really loved. And I loved being there. And we spent a lot of time there, the Loaded guys and I. And I wanted to write about it because I just had so much fun there. It was, and I mean, one of the overriding memories was Pete Doherty working behind the bar because he was so young.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
He wasn't particularly mouthy or anything. He was just this fresh-faced young sort of 17, 18-year-old, whatever he was. That was something that was kind of strange. But that was like a home from home for me. I love that. And then when he bought the Boogaloo, which, if you've never been to London or you've never been to the Boogaloo, do go up there. It's just like 100 yards down the road from Highgate Station on the main road.
It's fantastic. It is. It
I
is.
know with him setting up a radio show. I think he got that idea from a place out in Brooklyn where he goes a lot. There was a little local radio station in the back of a cafe or something.
Well,
And
this is where we were birthed from. So we was on a local radio show called Phoenix, and then we went up to do. Funny enough, you talk about Libertines. We done John Hassel from Libertines, and in Boogaloo, and then after that, we was offered a show, and then we'd done a show for 3 years there, and it was just chaos every Sunday. It was chaos. We've had like Steve Diggle from the Buzzcocks trying to grab his pie and cutting off everyone from Jules Holland and Top of the Pops, and it's being plugged into people eating their Sunday dinner. We're like, no. It really hit
who's
a
the best
chord.
person you've interviewed on the radio show or the podcast? Who's your favourite interview?
Who's my favourite? I'm really enjoying, because I've built this studio myself, so I'm really enjoying this new. I know it sounds contrived. I'm enjoying this new Voices of a Ceremony, like doing this one-on-one and a very a personal thing.
Who have you interviewed that you had the best stories?
I'll always say Alan McGee was great. He was he was really cool. Steve Diggle was cool. Tess Parks, yourself, right now. We've had. I can't even tell you. There's over 100 shows. You know what I mean? There's well over 100 shows of we've done like takeover shows, interviews. People come down and see us and do all this stuff. But like just to do this in my garden.
Is that where you are now?
Yeah. I built this studio like because I wanted to be I wanted to own my own content, basically.
Yeah, good idea. I think that basically the opportunity for people to create their own and own their own content is fantastic because if you go all the way back to when I was like doing my fanzine in Leeds in 1984.
Zag.
I had to create my own fanzine because there wasn't really anywhere other than that I could write. There was a local What's On and political paper called Leeds of a Paper that printed about 10 reviews by me, and then you'd sort of send things into the music weeklies hoping that it might get printed. But the immediacy of being able to do a podcast, the immediacy of being able to do something straight to camera that you put on YouTube is, it's so easy and open. As you said, the challenge is how do you reach the audience? And I'd say the answer to that is just for it to be unique and really entertaining. And I think what I like online, on Instagram, is when I'm reading new stuff about things that I love.
Absolutely, yeah.
The things that I didn't know. I remember I'm quite a big. I'm not a film obsessive. I'm not I don't know masses about. I'm not. I don't study film, but I really like it if I read. When the people do those little news story kind of, multiple page Instagram things, posts. when you learn something new about something that you love. I like that. And I think also quite often people who are involved in things that aren't the main person, you know, the first Rolling Stone to get his autobiography out was Bill Wyman, and he'd kept diaries, and he you know, he got a lot less attention than Mick Jagger. You know, as
Yeah.
Mick had no idea what, and even when you read Keith Richards' book, there's a chapter by Kate Moss. I mean, it's like, I'm not really fucking interested in Kate Moss's opinion on Richard
No.
cottage cheese pie or whatever it was that she writes about. And but you know, I think if you could find people who were involved in things that weren't necessarily the center of attention, they often have a really good eye for the detail because they were so amazed, you know. And obviously, I mean, unfortunately, people change things as life goes on, and they exaggerate things if they're not at the center of it. But just one time, I worked with a guy called David Nobbs, and those two guys, Mitchell and Webb, they're funny, very funny comedy guys.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, they wrote a sitcom about my time at GQ for the BBC, and David Nobbs had written Reggie Perrin and A Bit of a Do, and he was a brilliant comedy writer himself, but 30 years before. And he was explaining to me the concept of a window. When you're watching a funny comedic situation, you need a window who is the view of normality within this kind of thing of chaos. So I guess you might argue in Curb Your Enthusiasm, the window might be his wife. But
Right.
in Faulty Towers, for instance, which was the example that David gave, the window is Polly, the maid in Faulty Towers. She's the one who, because she's relatively normal, she doesn't have any quirks. She's just trying to get a job done. And although she tries to, you know, usually helps out Basil Fawlty, it's through her relatively normal view that everything else seems fucking insane.
Yeah.
So I think, which this is a really long answer to your question, that if you could find the people who were the window on interesting situations, then that in
Like
it,
yourself. Like yourself.
yeah, but I was at the center of what was going on with my magazines. But I think if you could find people who, like for instance, a friend of mine's dad was a body double for a very, very famous actor. And the actor's still alive, but sadly his dad's not alive. But when he tells me stories about what he had to do, they're brilliant. You know, they're just like, in fact, when we finish, I'll give you his number or something, because he's done a lot of things himself. He would be worth talking to. He's quite well known in the clubbing world. But
No, thank you. Thank you.
when he talks about um, you know, his dad's adventures, and nobody, I don't even know the name of his dad. He's just my mate's dad. But though that insight in what it's like being on, you know, the set of, you know, an Oscar-winning thriller, but he's actually taking the part of the actor. You know, that for me, I really like it when you get those different perspectives rather than just the most basic presentation of information, which is Wikipedia, or prior to that press releases or whatever the official.
But this is why I like to do what I do. Like I like to reach out to people such as yourself or whatever. But I'm trying to reach out to people that change counterculture with huge stories, but also huge inspiration. And I believe that you are that. Do you know what I mean? Like I was just gonna say, if I could hone in again to James Brown editorial.
Yes, what I was like then.
So we're talking to James Brown editorial. I'm gonna ask you just off the cuff. Give me a loaded interview for a job. So say I was going to come there for as a writer. What would you ask?
Well, I did. I mean, I did
So
ask you. I
I'm
asked
now sat in front of you.
at the beginning. I used to ask people who they supported,
Right.
if their girlfriend had any mates, and if they knew anyone that could get us any drugs. And
Uh,
I asked those three questions in all seriousness because I wanted to see how they reacted to it, because I knew that was going to be the standard of discussion in the office. And normally when people apply for jobs, they send you a CV or a covering letter and some examples of their work. So I could very quickly see if they were a good writer or a good sub editor or things like that. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to find out what the person, in a very small snapshot, what is the person like? Are they funny? Are they easy to get on with? So another two examples that would be that I used to know some guys who own some bars in Islington and Hackney, and they told me that when they hired a guy to work in the bar staff, they would take him to play five-a-side in their weekly five-a-side, because that was after they'd given him the job, because they wanted to see what the person was like in that environment, and it gives some insight into how they might be in the team. And then likewise, I don't know why I was thinking about this, but I was thinking about my PA when I worked at my own company, IFG. And then what I wanted was, I wanted somebody, as well as being excellent at organizing my working life, would be really resourceful as well. So, and
right.
I remember the woman who got the job, the reason that we gave her the job was because I said she showed up absolutely soaked. She'd cycled to the interview. And but I remember saying, so her name's Paula Davey, and I said, what would, I mean, this is probably quite boring, really, but and she said, how, if I needed 20 t-shirts made for the staff with something on, how would you do that? And she said, I'll just call my mate, he does t-shirts for bands. So that was enough. The fact that she was kind of plugged in to the likely non-day-to-day administerial roles that she was required. And I think when I was interviewing people, I wanted to see what they were like as people rather than what they were just like as the profession, as what they could. But you know what? My memory is with Loaded. One was, we were kind of short of people. There was a couple of,
Really?
yeah, there was a couple of people I interviewed. There was one guy that I became friends with years later called Steve Hill, who was a very funny computer games writer. Steve would have been good. And then probably 14, 15 years ago, I went on a trip kayaking to America, to Canada, and I met two guys on there. And I remember thinking, these two, Duncan Forgan and Dave Lewis, who is a comedian now, he actually hosts comedy night at the Boogaloo. I can remember thinking these two guys would have been brilliant on Loaded. And that was one of the few times when I regretted that was no longer there, that I couldn't just give them jobs and sort of wind the clockwork key up and just set them off, which is what I could do with Martin Deason and the other guys, just point them in a direction to apply their talent for writing or photography to a particular situation. And but there weren't masses of people that were banging on the door that were immediately obvious, and there was never anybody that I saw on any other magazine that prompted me to do what I did, what the NME did when they hired me from Sounds, where they just came to me and said, we want to give you a job. It wasn't like, when you're in maybe in football, it's just, as I said, the thing I love, when you see somebody playing for another team and the bigger team go and buy them, there weren't loads of people kicking around. There
But
was
like,
there
just
was
like,
Gavin there was Gavin Hills. Gavin Hills wrote for the Loaded a little bit and more for the Face. So it was always nice when Gavin did something for us, just because he was kind of like us, although he was mainly over on the Face. But there weren't that many people that were outside of the title that I was thinking, got to get them. There was a guy called Mark Frith who went on to become the editor of
but
Smash.
what makes you think yes, you're going to be correct?
Well, I actually wrote something about this, and maybe I'll send you. I don't know whether to put it in this project I'm working on. But I once gave a job to a bloke who'd helped me win a bet at a racetrack. And I just really liked him. The art director of GQ and I were at some, away day with some, sort of a jolly down at Ascot or Epsom or somewhere. And we met this goofy looking kid with like curly black hair, and he looked a bit like Plug. He had sticky out ears and teeth.
From the Beano.
He looked a little bit like a kid from Once Upon a Time in America. And he really liked betting, but he'd run out of money. And I was saying, no. He was making money on the bets and we didn't. And he said, go to the cash point. I've got a great tip for the next race. So we went, we didn't even know there was a cash point at the racetrack. So Tony and I went and got the money. We got like 50 quid each. And Mowgli, as he became nicknamed when he, Mogs said, put your money on that. And we both won like 250 quid on the last race.
Brilliant.
And I said to him, what do you do for a living? Why are you at this thing? He said, oh, I'm a sub-editor on a trade mag. I said, what else are you into? He said, oh, I'm really into fashion and da 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 da. And I pulled Tony aside and I said, should we give him a job? Because we needed a sub-editor on GQ. He said, great. Tony Chambers would be like maybe a good guy to interview, although he's very sort of design and stuff like that. He's more like Brian, I guess, in design than me. But and Tony was like, yeah, let's give him the job. And he joined GQ. Somebody, the production director, called him Mowgli. Well, Mogs, me giving him that job, he might have done this anyway, but that started his career in a higher level of media. He ended up saving people's lives.
Fucking hell, really?
He ended up working at Roma FC, doing the social media and the content. And he started doing something in Italy like they used to do in America in the 80s, where they put missing kids on milk cartons. He started using Roma's social media, their program, to help look for runaway kids or missing kids or
Brilliant.
homeless kids. And they found loads of them. And they were like, I mean, that was just genius. You could never have seen that this guy was going to end up changing and saving people's lives when he was just giving me and Tony a tip. So that obviously had nothing to do with me at all, his ability and vision to do that. But I helped give him, I gave him that job on GQ. So I was right then. And it was just an inkling that he had something about him. He was perfectly confident, even though he was probably 15 years younger than me and Tony. He was in his early 20s at the time. He had a sort of a strange, confident cockiness about him that I really liked. And he did brilliantly, to go on. And he worked for his club, Liverpool, before he went to Roma. And he built up, as social media and digital content was becoming a much bigger thing. He was on top of that at Liverpool. And so I think, even though I played Tony a small part in his career, that would be an example where I was right, and there weren't 9 appointments that were wrong. It wasn't like I'm just picking one good one. But
I think you're always right in your choices, James. Like
no,
from what I've gathered. And what I'm trying to establish here is when I'm saying, give me a bloody interview from Loaded. Say you were sat in your office where the door was never closed, and I walked in.
To be honest, I mean, I remember one time interviewing Mark Rinaldi, who was a mate of a mate, to be the picture edit, and I was so hungover, just lay under the bed and shouted questions. I lay under the metal desk.
What questions?
And I mean, I told you, I asked 4 or 5 questions. It was that easy, quick.
And that was it. That was the standard.
Yeah, because we didn't have a lot of time. We were going live. I mean, it seemed like a long time that it took from when I presented the idea that would become Loaded.
I think you'd be a great boss. I said it to you the other day. You'd be a fucking fantastic boss to work for.
September 92, I presented it, and then it was given the go-ahead that over a year later, when there was about, I mean, it might even have been given a go ahead at the start of '94, and we had like about 9 or 10 weeks to get the issue together. But so there really wasn't a lot of time for fucking about, and in a way, that helped. When Christian Smith came in to do the production, we gave him the job because he'd been the production editor with a big issue. It wasn't like we had 6 different production editors to choose from. I don't remember interviewing anyone else for that post. We gave the job to Martin. Alan Lewis and I gave the job to Martin Deason to be the sub-editor because he'd written a piece about drinking, a piece about breaking up with his girlfriend, and he'd written for Details, which was a magazine that wasn't that far away from sort of the audience. I mean, although that was kind of a swish downtown Manhattan scene, it was kind of like a good magazine. So these were people. There were not. There wasn't a lot of people queuing up to work for Loaded because you'd read an article about the idea that IPC were going to launch a magazine for men, a mass market magazine for men, and people were queuing up in the trade press, Press Gazette, in Campaign, in the Evening Standard, in the Guardian, just to say it will never work. There will never be. Men won't read magazines like women read. I thought that we would read it. I just thought that nobody had been very good at trying to do it, because those magazines like Esquire and GQ, they were American magazines with American sensibilities. And Arena was like, I think when Nick Logan started Arena, he told me that he wanted it to be a sports lifestyle magazine, which is why it was called Arena. And then he kind of he halted at the end and put fashion in and more broad subjects. But I mean, not
I mean,
a,
I've
a
just
lot.
sent you an email of an article that I wrote for Let It Bleed. Did
Yeah,
you manage to read it?
yeah, I did read it.
And what do you think of it? Would it have made the cut?
No,
Thanks, thanks,
it
thank
wouldn't
you.
have
What?
it wouldn't have made the cut to go into Loaded for a number of reasons. One, we didn't often put things in that people submitted, and that was the strength of social media and the internet. That would be a place where you could put things in. But two, it was about something that came out in the late 60s. So
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah,
when we did retrospective piece, I would have absolute experts like Gavin Martin, who was a very good film writer, or John Wilde, who knew his stuff. And these guys had written thousands and thousands and thousands of articles. So what I thought from reading, I thought it was really well structured and it was good, interesting subjects. But my advice to you or anyone else who's wanting to write is, one, write about what you know personally.
okay.
So you were writing about the influence of the politics of the time, of Vietnam, the criminal situation that with things like Charles Manson, and the influence that darkness maybe had
Yeah,
on the making of that record. Uh, you were talking about what went through the experience of the singer, the female singer on it, um, and and I really liked that record, so I enjoyed reading it. It was a very short piece, but what I
yeah,
think is, this is my advice for people who want to write: write loads. Write
yeah.
absolutely loads and loads and loads and loads, and by that I don't mean write. Don't send me 10,000 words about Let It Bleed.
this
Having
is
said that,
this is what the whole thing was
I have
about.
read, I have read multiple amounts of 10,000 words on that era of the Rolling Stones in True Life Adventures of Rolling Stones and Stones Touring Party, STP. They're two of my favourite books. Um, but write like 10,500 word articles, rather
Yeah,
than 500,000 words on 10 subjects. Write and write and write and write and write. Write about what you know. So, what would be great for you to write is about doing your radio show at the Boogaloo, finding that location, that experience, as you've talked about on here. Write about what you know. Write about what other people haven't written about, and just keep doing it, because I felt like you were writing big. You were kind of trying to make grand, broad statements, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it kind of all made sense. It wasn't. I like the fact it was short because I could actually read it and come back to you. So that was great. Rather than people sometimes send you fucking books, or and you just don't have time to read them. Not sometimes, all the time. People want me to read their books, whether they're published or not. I haven't got time. Reading is the thing that I love doing for myself. I don't want to do that just for somebody else. It's like, must be like if you make films, people say, "Will you watch my film?" You can like, well,
I mean, my point was, James, was obviously I wrote that. I think it was like a shindig um, issue. I didn't submit it, so it was like my sort of touch into rock journalism, and I was quite proud of it. I thought, oh, that's really cool because I'm into that music. And
was it honestly,
but
Mitchell?
the but the but the
It
thing is
wasn't.
that the
It
thing I
wasn't.
was going to talk to you about was
Wasn't terrible. When I said no, I was being brutally honest. But
no. That's
it
I
wasn't.
told you to be brutally honest.
It wasn't terrible. It made sense. It made some good points. I felt like I've kind of read that information before and that take before. But if you sent me 500 words about setting up your radio show with the
Yeah,
Boogaloo, that's your story.
yes, of
How did
course.
you do it? Who
The only
did you have
reason. Yeah,
involved? What was
sorry,
the
the only reason, James, I sent you that was because I was going to get into exactly what you just said. What tips could you give to like young, inspiring writers? Because I don't think I could do it. I'm not willing to go to gigs every single night of the week. Blah 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 blah. I'm like now getting into like old man territory where I go to bed at 9 o'clock, and I'm all right with that.
Yeah, but
Um,
to me, that would make a great piece, for me, because what you'd have there is if you wrote a piece about saying, the benefit. I woke up this morning having basically done football game drugs. I mean, done that football game for 13 hours, 14 hours, fucking worn out. My eyes were tired. And I was just waking up. And when you wake up with a hangover and you focus on one bit of your body that feels nice,
yeah.
because there's 5 different bits that feel bad. You kind of fucking mouth's hurting because you've been like chewing away, and your face is all smoky because of, I mean, not anymore, but you used to be in bars and your clothes fucking stink, and you've still got clothes on. You woke up, you've got really bad pain in your back because you realize you fell asleep on a wall, and maybe maybe you've got bruised knuckles because you had to fucking got into a scuffle or something, and you just try and think of one little bit that feels good, and you focus on that. Was I woke up in my son's bed? He's on holiday. I was like, I could feel my socks. I thought I've gone to sleep. I've got my pants, my socks. They feel really nice.
Oh
The
yeah.
warmth of my socks. So just that one thing, I remember thinking there must be other people who feel like this when they wake up. So when you wanted to, if you wrote about, not necessarily, oh, I used to go out clubbing and now I go to bed at 9 o'clock. That's a much repeated cliche that you hear on Facebook from people who are just, they're kind of basically diarising their decline. Um, is that a word, diarising? But anyway, they. But if you just wrote about what it was like setting up a radio show, and you said, "Oh, you had Steve Diggle doing this or that, and Alan McGee came in, and you got different people." That is your experience. That's interesting. That's something that you have got immediate first-hand experience of.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the reader, you're getting insight into something you didn't know about. Whereas reading about Let It Bleed, which was recorded like decades and decades ago, and has had hundreds of thousands of words written about, but also I've had the opportunity to listen to that and enjoy it myself. It, I think write about what you know, totally and open,
Yeah.
and
There
don't.
we go.
Yeah, that's what I would say to people. And then the other thing I'd say is don't send it to me, right? That's just because I don't want to read any other stuff. And also, I feel like I've done my time very, very voluntarily and very, very enthusiastically, opening emails, opening letters, searching social media for good writers. I've spent years doing that, and I've probably set 30 or 40 people off on their way to have professional careers, or I've helped them along the way to get to a level where there's an audience for them, and it's someone else's turn now. So
Well, hopefully you'll put me
then
on my way, James. Hopefully you put me on my way, mate. But sorry for sending that absolute shit piece to you. But
oh, no,
I'm
hold
only
on.
joking. I'm only
I didn't.
joking.
I did. First of all, I've just got to say, I didn't say it was absolutely shit. So you've got.
it's,
If,
it's
if
okay.
to be honest, Mitchell, if it was shit, I'd have said something really polite and oh yeah, it was great, really enjoyed it, thanks for it, so that you didn't have reason. But because then the other thing is, you've always got to be careful when you're in the presence of somebody who've asked to comment on it. I remember Wayne Hussey from the Mission once. I don't know if you remember them. They were a goth band from Leeds.
Yeah.
He was at a guy called Miles Hunt's house. Miles was the singer in the Wonder Stuff. They were a great pop group, and
Wonder Stuff are great.
I was friends with Miles and his wife Mary Ann. She worked on the Enemy. She's on the Six Music as well, Mary Ann Hobbs. And I was there just seeing Mary Ann. I just popped out to see Mary Ann, and I slagged the Mission off at various times. I really liked the Sisters early on, which Wayne Hussey came out of to start the Mission, but I wasn't a fan of the Mission. Although later in life, I had met a couple of the members over the years who were fine, but they were listening to Wayne Hussey's new record, and I could see Miles having to listen to it. He's a fellow musician, maybe they'd toured together, maybe they were mates, but I had no filter at that point. And he said, "You're not spending much time listening to my record." I said, "Well, I don't fucking like your band, mate. I'm not listening to
Yeah.
your record. I come to see my friend who's in the kitchen." And he looked stunned. The
It
word
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I
was,
mean, I'd done this with Alan McGee when we got him first on the show, like so many years back. I'd messaged him just for a quote for a poster for my band, and he
okay,
was in
great.
like Greece or something, and it was like so funny. He was like, "Yeah, I'll listen to your record or whatever." And then he put a piece in the Independent or something like that, saying, "Oh, there's no music coming from the streets, from the boroughs." And I got the right up, and this was around about the time I was taking a lot of cocaine and stuff like that, and I called him out on it. And then years later, we had him as a guest, and I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna fucking ask your opinion because you're in the Boogaloo with me," and he didn't remember. So I was like, "Right." In the middle of the show, I was like, "Right, listen, I'm playing my song for you. I asked you for this opinion years prior, and we done it." And he turned around and went, "Yeah, shit." I was like,
The reality of it is there's two things here. Is one, somebody like him who's discovered a number of good bands will be inundated with thousands of
"Of course, of course, of course."
of, of now, it's whether it's audio files or actual records or tapes or whatever the fuck people send their music in now and forever. So you become a bit immune to it. Like when I left the NME in 1992, my record collection, even though I'd spent 5 years getting any free records sent, all the records that I really liked sent, my record collection immediately got better the moment I left the NME, because any record that I was, it was just kind of when CDs were starting, and any music that I went out and bought, well, because it was something I wanted to hear. It wasn't because there was an obligation to listen to a demo tape sent by a band or a band manager or a friend of the band or a publicist or whatever.
But then people like you and Alan really matter to people like me
I
at
know,
that
but
point.
you cannot listen to everything that comes, because if you do that, if your job becomes, and
Full time listening.
this is the same for people who publish books, people who make films, and so on. If you spend if you give a fair amount of time to every single person who ever contacts you, you don't have the time to work on the people who are really good. That's one thing, and
Of course, yeah.
you also don't have the time to do the things you want to do as a person yourself. I have people on Facebook who who get in touch and they want me to listen to to their records, and it's like, Why? Why? I no longer do this. I used to write about music when I was a teenager, and then in my 20s. I haven't really written about music apart from the odd profile for somewhere in the region of 35 years.
I
And
suppose it must feel nice that you still matter.
now I don't matter because my opinion then was one of somebody who say they were 21 years old, and I thought my opinion mattered then, and it did matter because it could influence his people's careers. Um, but actually, you know what? If I said in 1970, in 1989, if I said your record shit, it's just my opinion, you know. Where the next person along might go, that's great, you know, that I fucking love that. And neither of us are right, you know. And neither of us are wrong either, you know. It's just your opinion. And now, many years later, you know, I went to see this guy who was kind of pestering me, his band, because he'd come to see me talk. I went, okay, I'll go see your band. You came to see me talk. I don't mind doing that. And they were a pretty good band, you know. I thought they were pretty good. And I actually told Alan about them. And and that's it. You know, I'm not going to become the manager. I'm not going to sit down and write a 500-word article for the NME because that's not my role to do that. Secondly, when I used to do that, I felt like, and I think probably there were a number of people felt like this, whether they were in radio broadcasting or concert promoting or being an agent or a manager or releasing records, whatever. You felt like you were trying to make things better, and it was exciting to find new things. I don't feel like that anymore. I would honestly rather listen to Let It Bleed because I know that I like that than I would, but I still like it when I look at a reel or, you know, a little clip online and it's got the music at the top, and I think the music's really good. I do that all the time. I click through and I go to Spotify or I go to whoever's hosting the music, but I don't then feel compelled to tell the world about it, which is what I did when I
No.
was 17 and 18. So that's just the danger. I actually think it's better. I understand the value of somebody who's had some success in influencing situations when they say, "Oh, this is great." I understand the value of that. John Peel used to do that for me, and some of the people in the magazines like Jamming and Zigzag and Enemy and so on would say that about my fanzine. So I understand the importance and the value of it. And I know that it lasts long. I get people asking me if I'll appear in documentaries about bands that I wrote a single review of in
Yeah.
1991. And it's kind of like, you know what? I had like maybe 120 records to go through. There's two great ones. There's about six that you like that aren't bad. And then there's another 20 you've kind of got to cover just to fill the length of the page up. And it, it's just part of the weekly process, you know? So sometimes people get in touch, and this is like, it's so long ago. It's such, and it was the best job
It's still
in the world.
important, James. It is still
It was
important.
important then, but it's not now.
It
I'm not.
is. I think so, and I think a lot of other
If
people
there's somebody
would.
out there with a vlog or a blog, they're the important ones. There'll be somebody playing music on a radio station. There'll be somebody doing, you know, setting something up like Boiler Room, or somebody doing a club night or whatever it is. They're the people that are influential and important. Not a guy whose hotspot as a music writer was like 1987 or something. It's irrelevant, you know. It's and I think that because also there's nothing I can do. I used to know I used to know the landscape, and I suppose this is what Alan challenges himself with. If anybody who works in and by the way, there's lots of people like Alan McGee who have found and developed lots of great artists. Their challenge is knowing the landscape. If you know the landscape and you hear a particular artist singing, or a band writing a song, or you know, a DJ remixing a track or whatever, you know how good it is against the other, you know, the benchmarks of the day, and you know it if it's in. I've not got a clue. So my opinion is actually untethered by what is good and what is not good. They're a huge.
I still think your opinion is valued. I'm just gonna ask you a couple of quick fire questions, James. Like,
Okay, let's do that because I've got a right. Actually, it's oh my god.
yes, I know you've got to get off. I'm gonna ask you a couple of quick fire questions and one final question.
Yep.
Quick fire questions.
Yes.
Did you ever discover or did you ever hear the tape with Helen Mirren? Where is it?
It's gone. I don't know. The woman that was transcribing it went, but I also think some of the things Helen said, particularly at GQ, wouldn't have got past the lawyer.
So that's out there somewhere still.
Yeah, but I mean, it could just have been left on a desk in GQ, taped over, thrown in a bin.
Have you ever heard back the Nick Cave, Shane McGowan, and Marky Smith tape?
Once
You have it. You have it.
I've still got it. Once I listened to the music that they played together.
Yeah. And are you going to upload it to YouTube for everyone else to hear?
What I might do is I've got a project coming out.
We're going to talk about the project. Hold
Yeah,
it. Hold
no,
it a little bit.
I might tie that in. I might tie that in with it in some way. I mean, the guy that made the film about the Pogues was Shane, really wanted it, and I couldn't find it at that point.
We're just coming up to your new project. My last quickfire question is: what happened to your fucking Z3 from Yaboa?
Actually, do you know what? But the explanation there is I wanted a particular. I'm not a big car guy. I saw a great car, and the guy that loaded it, who's a car freak, and said, "Oh, you can't get them." And his attitude miffed me a bit because we were living in a time when I felt you could get anything you wanted,
I
and,
love that in the book when you said that,
and
and
yeah,
I agree.
I told my mate about it. It was a football agent, and he said, "Oh my god, I've just ordered one of them for Tony Yeboah, and he's going back to play in Germany. So this one is free, is available." So I took Tony Yeboah's car. But the funny thing was about 3 years after I got that car, I got a letter saying that I'd never paid for it. I mean, I suppose it was a reflection of a nice time in my life where I wasn't having to check direct debits. But basically, the licensing company, not the licensing, the people that should have been drawing down the money from my account on a monthly basis to pay the car off had never set it up.
Oh no! Later on.
So I didn't have to pay for it basically, and then they just showed up and took it. But I didn't know anything about that. I was like thinking, what? I think I might have had to pay like the first bit of it or something like that. But that was quite funny. So they came and had that, but it was fine. It was a nice. It was a fucking great car. Now it's become a classic. You know that Z3.
Absolutely. It's one of my favourite cars as well. That's why it did hone in on me as well. That's why I feel very sort of similar to you and everything you like and everything you've done in your life. Essentially, you're like the Forrest Gump of my life, where you've went and done
I've
it
not
all.
seen that. I've not seen Forrest Gump either, so I don't know what that means.
So Forrest Gump is just this guy that ended up doing like 1,000,001 things and was great at everything he did.
I don't feel like I've done much at all.
Behave yourself.
I feel like I've been active for like maybe 8 years of my adult life.
Behave yourself. You've
And
done
no,
so much.
honestly, in terms of the speed of what I've done things when I've had projects that I've liked, I've spent years and years since I sold my own publishing business. I was telling somebody this last week, not shaping and directing my creative professional outlook just because people started offering me money. So if people would say, look, will you come and do these talks? That was good fun, but they pay me a lot of money. I earned a lot of money, in the late noughties, after I sold IFG, for doing all sorts of different consultancies and things, or doing creative things just for maybe 2 weeks or one morning or whatever. And it meant that instead of just sitting down and saying, "What am I gonna do next?" People just kept offering me money to do things, and, as a result of that, I haven't really You know, when the Guardian interviewed me about Animal House, the guy, the author, the interviewer, Tim, said he's kind of been James has been on the periphery of the media for the last kind of 20 years or something. And I actually thought, yeah, I'd never seen that written down, but some of that was through choice. Some of it was that there were no jobs that I really wanted, and some of it was the fact that I didn't really need to go out and get an everyday job like a lot of editors that I know or respected who've just had to keep doing work for whatever reason. I made quite a lot of money, and
They could make a film about your life, James. They could.
no, no,
From like early leads
I've
to.
sold my rights to the. I have sold. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I have sold the rights to make a kind of a fictional, i.e., not a factual, not documentary that existed, but I have sold the rights to my book to somebody that is developing
You've met people like fucking Hunter S. Thompson.
a project.
You know, you've gone like Michael Caine. You've met everybody. Spent like that
No,
time with
but you
Helen
know what?
Mirren. You've
Just
done all of
meeting,
this mad stuff.
just meeting people isn't really. It's
Yeah,
what you
but
do.
James, someone like me that looks up to you, we go, Jesus fucking Christ, young men would love to have the life that you've had.
That's true. I know that, and I'm appreciative of it. That I think something that good that came from that documentary is I had a lot of younger guys come up to me and say, "I never knew Loaded was like that. I thought it was just how it was, in this century when it, just rubbish." And so that was good. That the origin story of Loaded was very different to what that and the other magazines that thought they were copying it became by the end of the 90s. So.
Oh, they're all shit. They're all shit. They're all junk. All them other magazines that followed Loaded were junk. They were.
Yeah, I mean, FHM and Maxim were pretty substantial products, but they didn't have the same sort of rock and roll content that Loaded did. But
No. I was
Mitch,
going to
you
ask
know
you
what?
two more quick fire questions,
Okay,
James.
okay, good.
Is rock and roll everything, or is it a great concept?
Well, it can be everything in your life, can't it? The outlook of a rock and roll lifestyle can be everything. Yeah, I think it can.
And in terms of, and this will make you laugh, the crisp World Cup.
Yes.
I want to talk about my favourite crisps of all time. Are these crisps, and where did this rank? These are the new version.
Smith's chipsticks. Yeah, you see, they wouldn't have been in the World Cup because they're not crisps.
Why are they not crisps?
Because they're made of they're composites of potato
Maize.
and maize. They're
But
not.
they are a maize and potato snack, right?
Yeah, but they're not just a sliced potato chip crisp thing.
So what? These didn't even rank into the World Cup.
No, but they could have, if we were still doing Loaded and doing those World Cup things, which we started, which lots of people ended up copying. They could have been snacks in bags.
Come on, what do you like them?
I have had those chipsticks, and what I find is they're really incredibly salty, so they make you want to drink after them. They're one of those things where once you open that bag, you'd suddenly find it was empty and wonder where it had gone. I mean, somebody I that like spend a lot of time with has recently revealed the love of the Monster Munch. So,
Is that a crisp?
no, it's not. Again, it's similar to that thing you hold up, but it's probably the same stuff that makes it, but it's in the shape of a monster's foot. But
Or
it's a
is it his hands?
the
Or is it the
monster.
monster? I think someone said it was the monster with his hands down
Oh
and
right,
his
I
feet.
thought. Well, there's a bag in the cupboard, so I'll go and have a look. But I thought that it was supposed to be like when you see the footprint of Bigfoot.
I thought that, and then someone said that the circle in the middle was the face, and the arms, and then the legs.
Well, as I say, I'm going to go and investigate that. Do you know what we did? Where was I made? One of the sort of the guidelines I wrote for Loaded or the rules was treat highbrow things in a throwaway fashion, uh, and treat and hold things that were seen as disposable and throwaway, you know, in a really revered way. You know, just subvert the way. If you walked into the Louvre and there was a fucking monster munch framed, that would be a very loaded outlook on life. And that's, I guess, also, you know, when somebody's putting a shark in a box of formaldehyde, there was the same sort of thinking, you know. I
Of
mean,
course.
we used to have posters of crisps, fish and chips, bacon sandwiches. It was just bizarre. You know, I think that was the thing that people didn't. I mean, that was the thing that people didn't realize. The critics, most of the people who've spoken about loaded in the media in the last 25 years, didn't know anything about it. They had a vague understanding of what it might be. But if you actually pick one up, like you've got the Irving Welsh issue there, you'll go in there and there'll be some stuff like that has never been in magazines before or since, but the readers absolutely loved. But
No.
you know what? I've got to go. It's 7 o'clock, 7:12. I've
All
actually
right.
got
Well, James, let me just ask you one last thing. What's the
okay.
new
Well,
project? What is the new project?
I'm just doing a visual version of my memoir, Animal House, because I've got. I mean, at the moment it's reduced to 3 boxes, but I had a whole lockup full of boxes of magazine dummies, um, set lists, letters from like musicians that people are interested in.
What's
Um,
the visual representation? Is it a film?
like a magazine or a book, just full of images. So it's like a
Brilliant.
color. So it's you know, if you pick up my memoir, Animal House, which maybe some people will, hopefully, that it's got like, you know,
Well, James, we're going to be doing a giveaway of your
yeah,
book.
you're gonna thanks. Look, I've got it here.
Um,
I've got like I've got your copies here, you know. So like if you read this book, it's got like thousands of words in it, 100,000 words. But this is just going to be images of stuff I've collected over the years. I've
is it
already.
like a coffee table book?
It's going to be more like it's going to feel like a magazine. We talked about whether to do it as a book, but it'll feel like a kind of a heavy magazine.
Perfect. Perfect. Perfect.
Okay, I'm asthmaed out. I can hardly talk. It's been
Thank
great
you.
to do it.
Thanks.
I've really enjoyed it. And don't take offense what I said about Let It Bleed, the article that you wrote, because
I find it very funny. I
well,
sent it to you. I sent it to you because I said to you, be brutal as possible, because I don't take offense or anything
no, but I
at
was
all.
constructive. If you hear the constructive points, there were some good points about it. And it's a
Thank
great
you.
record. You should both go away and listen to it. I've got someone staring at me.
All right. Okay. Thank you. But anyway, James, we're going to give away. We're going to give away Animal House. We're going to give away a few signed copies. Thank you so much for being one of the greatest voices of the ceremonies on this series and of all time.
It's
Thank
been
you
a
so
great
much.
interview. I've really enjoyed it. And I'm going to give you a few numbers of other people to call. I think would love to do this interview.
Let's stay in touch.
Okay. See you
Thank you
later, mate.
so much,
Bye.
James. Thank you. Cheers.